Hello and welcome to our Management 161 Chapter 1 lecture. I want to pick up where we left off last day. Previously, we considered the managerial pyramid and the various levels: strategic, tactical, operational, and non-managerial, and considered how they were responsible for viewing the organization and how long into the future their activities and their thinking needed to reach. We also considered the framework, our four-stage or four-phase framework for the semester: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. And we looked at efficiency and effectiveness and risk in relation to managerial thinking and managerial action. We considered the roles that Mintzberg proposed as he executed his dissertation, and followed managers around to sort of understand truly what they did. He articulated a number of roles, which we covered. And then Katz, who presented a skills view of management for our consideration, and we looked briefly at that. Today we're going to consider organizations. That'll be the context in which much of managerial activity will be conducted. We'll see next chapter that organizations exist in a set of concentric circles that will represent various levels of their external environment, as well as considering the internal environment of an organization, particularly its culture. But today we'll confine ourselves to defining an organization and then comparing and contrasting traditional and new organizational types. We'll look at a variety of sizes and types of organizations: public, private, those sorts of things. Consider ethics in relation to organizations broadly and managerial action, as well as corporate social responsibility, that's the CSR on the screen, and examine a little bit around workforce diversity. The last two bullet points, ethics, CSR, and diversity, being issues, more issues-based in relation to management and organizations. So, what's an organization? Well, it's quite simply a deliberate arrangement of people, and they're there to accomplish some specific purpose. That purpose, of course, is self-determined. The organization, as a collective, but also as its own almost entity, decides for itself what is worthy of pursuing, and it devotes resources to accomplishing those things. Organizations will typically have more than one goal and will implement strategies and then tactics and then operational activities in order to accomplish those things. But we have people in a deliberate arrangement pursuing those goals on behalf of the organization. And the definition will suit our purposes for much of what we consider this semester. When we take a little bit of time to look at alternative arrangements of organizations, we will perhaps see that the formal structure of an organization may alter somewhat. That will be informed by the goals of the organization. Structure and strategy often influence one another. Here's our compare and contrast of the traditional organization versus the new, or as I termed it, the new-ish organization. The new organization in many ways has the characteristics it has in direct response to those of the traditional organization. But that is not to say that the traditional organization, A, does not exist. They still do. And it is not to say that the traditional organization was bad. It was limited, it turns out, as the competitive environment has altered. Traditional organizations find themselves perhaps less able to meet the emerging reality. But make no mistake, traditional organizations, for better or worse, have got us to where we are in the moment. But what's a traditional organization look like? Well, first and foremost, they're stable. They're stable in the sense that both their orientation to their competitive environment and the way that they arrange themselves is static. Change would be a challenge. It's not undoable, but would require considerable effort and time, perhaps time, on the part of the organization. A traditional organization operates best in an environment where the variables are stable and the number of them relatively constant. And so its responses, its competitive actions, can be determined and maintained. Stability is a nice thing. Unfortunately, modern competitive environments aren't as stable as perhaps previous ones were. Secondly, traditional organizations are inflexible, and they're inflexible from the perspective of you have your job, you have your role, they have a way of approaching their competitive environment, and changing that is not likely something they do easily or at all. There's the historical anecdote of Henry Ford, the automobile manufacturing giant, who once said you can have any color of automobile you like as long as it's black in color. And that represented the inflexibility of his particular orientation to manufacturing and selling automobiles. He made black-colored automobiles for reasons that probably benefited the Ford Motor Company, and those were your choices. You could have black or you could have black. Traditional organizations are job-focused. They are not focused per se on a variety of skills as a way of developing people inside the organization or specifically pursuing organizational objectives. While you need knowledge, skills, and abilities to obtain and keep a job, the role, if you like, is the focus of the organization, and the person filling that then takes on aspects of the role. The traditional organization is also individually oriented. The team orientation is fairly new, understanding that new is a relative term in the history of organizations. Nonetheless, a traditional organization would promote the individual and their success, and perhaps craft an environment, where a person could be promoted. It was very much an individual orientation. Traditional organizations also have many rules, policies, procedures that they follow fairly faithfully and strictly. These rules are not, at their core, illogical. They are typically responses to situations and challenges that the organization has encountered. And so in order to not only understand those situations, but to prescribe their organizational action or activities within a given situation, they formed rules. Of course, rules can be quite constraining, especially when you come up against a situation that demands that you bend or even do away with the rules. Traditional organizations then find themselves acting, as we saw in bullet point 2, an inflexible way. There is a real predisposition in organizations of the traditional type to work very prescribed hours. Long ago now, when I was quite a young man, banks in certain parts of Canada would be open Monday, Tuesday, say 10 to 5, 10 to 4, a half day on Wednesday, and then the full day again, 10 to 5, 9 to 5, Thursday and Friday, and weekend hours just weren't something that they did. And this was a rigidly defined way of interacting with both their customers and their competitive environment. And there were some good reasons for that, but again, the new challenges of sort of 24/7, 365 were not something that a traditional organization would really be inclined to engage with. By contrast, the new organization is fairly dynamic as opposed to stable. That means it has both dynamicism and flexibility, the 2 points here, and really structured and oriented towards responding to the competitive challenges, the needs of customers. And you can sort of begin to see then that traditional really wants to operate within an environment that is comfortable for it, whereas new organizations really take discomfort and challenge and change pretty much as a matter of fact. New organizations, rather than job-focused, are skills-focused. They tend to be team-oriented, the collective over the individual. As I suggested just a moment ago, a new organization would be far more customer-oriented, meeting their needs on their timelines, rather than sort of dictating to the customer what it is that the organization would offer and do and when. New organizations, as the bottom point suggests here, the workdays really have no time boundaries, and that is a good and bad thing. In terms of the organization meeting its obligations and engaging in competitive activities, that challenge can go on pretty much around the clock around the world. Of course, the challenge for organizations and people inside it are how to find a work-life balance, because as the new organization has sort of emerged, the new employee has emerged as well, and there is a sense that is growing that working to live and living to work, are now competing types of ideas, and people want work-life balance. And one of the things that, no time boundaries for a particular organization's activities can present challenges for its employees and for the organizational culture. We're going to briefly look at the idea of sort of sizes and types of organizations. SMBs or SMEs, small to medium-sized businesses, or perhaps another way of saying it, small to medium-sized enterprises, are in Canada the majority provider of work and competitive elements. The large organizations, those greater than 500 employees, typically represent about 3% of organizations in Canada, and that means the 97% falls to these smaller organizations. And while 500 employees is not necessarily small, it's a working definition used both in Canada and the U.S. And this point is simply to highlight to you that it's these not these global corporations that produce the majority of work or the majority of outcomes, but rather these smaller organizations. In terms of types of organizations, there's a number of ways of considering this. The list here includes publicly held organizations. Publicly held means that they have a share structure and that ownership is available to organizations or individuals in the general market space. And you will typically see that represented in stock or share ownership. Privately held organizations are exactly the opposite. There is no opportunity for private investment, for public investment. You and I could not buy shares in that company. And up until recently, I think it was Magna Corporation, a major Canadian manufacturer of automobile parts, was held exclusively privately by the family. And I have a sense that perhaps it's now gone public. Public sector organizations, not to be confused with publicly held organizations, are branches of government. There are also organizations that work in general society, doing general societal good. Crown corporations are profit-seeking arms of government. Petro-Canada at one time was a Crown corporation. Canada Post is a Crown corporation. And they're simply profit-seeking arms of government, and government does not seek profit. Another type of organization present in the competitive environment are subsidiaries of foreign organizations. I did a strike through for Sears, because Sears is no longer in Canada, but they were for many, many decades. Canada Safeway, again, has been bought by Sobeys. So Canada Safeway is not a foreign organization anymore. They are, in fact, owned by a Canadian entity. However, Microsoft has a subsidiary, and they are American, as is General Motors and Ford Motor Company. So there's just some examples of the various types of organizations present in the organization in the competitive environment, and we'll consider some others later on in another chapter's content. All right, what are some of the challenges that managers face? Two before you, they were included in the initial introduction for this recorded lecture. Ethics, first, is almost a subset of morality. And morality is a general shared human understanding of things that are right and things that are wrong. And understand that based on cultural influences and things like that, there can be some either greater or lesser emphasis, just again depending on sort of the collective orientation to the ideas of what is right and what is wrong. Ethics are much more of a almost an applied sense of morality, and really does consider what is right and what is wrong in any given circumstance. The challenge to be ethical is persistent in management activities, primarily because the urge to be efficient and effective and reduce risk sometimes comes into conflict with broader societal right and wrong values, what is considered to be right, what is considered to be wrong. And managers may from time to time be tempted to act unethically while being rewarded for doing that because they have helped the organization meet its goals in perhaps ways that are either not considered fair or even legal. And ethics then becomes a significant consideration for managers and for organizations. Historically, there's enough ethical lapses in the history of profit-seeking organizations to suggest there is a need for and a deserved emphasis on ethics, particularly in college and university business curriculums. The orientation, though, of these post-secondaries is almost always to not teach hardcore sort of semester-long courses in ethics, but really to try and introduce it in bits and pieces across the curriculum, regardless of whether that's an effective way to do it or not. In fact, that's the way it's currently being done and historically has been done once business schools figured out they actually needed to highlight ethics. You'll see the implications of ethics almost weekly, monthly, if you like, in various publications talking about breaches of ethics or ethical lapses or suggestions or accusations of unethical treatment or behavior. And one of the responses that organizations and management broadly have sought to implement beyond the first bullet point, which is really around education, teaching, and that's a good strategy, is to create and use codes of ethics and hold employees accountable using those codes. Our second point on the slide here is around corporate social responsibility, and it's an issue centered around the fact that organizations typically are fairly resource-rich and influential in their sort of local environment. By extension, then, if you think of corporations as an entity, it's almost a little tempting to think of them as a, ultra person, if you like. The question becomes, with all those resources and with all that influence, is there not the need or responsibility by those entities to give back? And so you will see corporate social responsibility pursued at a couple of levels. At a high level, it's strategic and in some ways sort of philosophical on behalf of an organization to figure out, A, if they even want to act in a corporate social corporate social way, and then secondly, how they're going to enact that. You will see elements of corporate social responsibility in Starbucks' attempts to increase the pay to their coffee growers, and to act responsibly in terms of the amount of waste they produce. And many organizations are attempting to do this. Cruise lines are attempting to use more eco-friendly fuel. Some of them, not all of them. Typically, shipping on the high seas of almost all kinds uses a grade of fuel called bunker fuel, which is almost barely refined, and it pollutes tremendously. And so corporate social responsibility suggests to cruise lines who are making money that maybe they ought to take some of their profits and look for ways to innovate so that when they do conduct their business on the high seas, that their pollution footprint is less. Paper straws instead of plastic straws at A&W, on and on and on, varying degrees of corporate social responsibility, acting in an environmental or a social sense. Any little league hockey team or baseball team that has sponsored jerseys or equipment is the recipient of some form of corporate social good, or large S. And these are useful and important things, and these are ways that organizations give back to the communities that they are part of and that they draw resources from. The classical view of corporate social responsibility, articulated by a number of business thinkers, including Peter Drucker, who I have a great amount of respect for, basically said that organizations exist to compete in the environment and maximize profits for the owners. What is shown here is stockholders or shareholders. That's a broader form of ownership of an organization. And that doing social good of any kind was expending corporate resources, maybe taking away from profits or using corporate time or other resources to do good, but that in turn unjustifiably increased costs and took ultimately away from the profit scenario for the owners. And that was the classical view. It said doing social good is not something organizations need to do or even ought to do. Excuse me, sorry about that. Contrast that with the socioeconomic or the new view, which says management needs to not only act on behalf of the organization in its profit-seeking activities, but ought to seek to improve and protect society's broader welfare. Again, as being part of that collective, that broader society, maybe ought to use their resources and their perhaps knowledge, other proprietary perhaps things, like water purification, for instance, to make the place they reside in better. There is a strong argument that corporations are not responsible just to stockholders, and one of the things you probably, or hopefully, I guess, will remember from Age of Walmart was the idea that when you brought a Walmart supercenter into a community, you upped traffic flow, you increased noise and light pollution, and so in some ways there are other elements in a particular locale who must bear up under your corporate presence. By extension, then, the middle bullet point says you should probably think and act more responsibly beyond just seeking and making profit for your ownership structure. And then the third point is just a general philosophy, which largely, for the socioeconomic view of corporate social responsibility, says firms have a moral responsibility to that broader society to do the right thing. And of course, arriving on what the right thing actually is might be a bit of a challenge. Each stakeholder group will likely have their idea of what that is. Nonetheless, if you take the broad idea of corporate social responsibility, those large resourced entities who draw from the community, from, if you like, the world, might have a responsibility beyond just their own profit seeking. This is from 2007, this quote, but it simply says, business practices are now an additional purchasing influence that guides people who engage with corporations for the purposes of conducting business. And there is a certain sense that in corporate social responsibility, you can enhance your appeal to your customer base when you not only act in a corporately responsible manner, but you, in fact, make that known. And it helps people in their decision making whether or not to engage with a company or a corporation. There are a number of ways of thinking about corporate social responsibility, and we won't linger here except to say that the extreme on the left, the obstructionist approach, is really a very old school, old-fashioned, self-centered way of being in a community, whereas the extreme right and the proactive approach embeds corporate social responsibility thinking and action in the organization from very much the beginning. And so Ben & Jerry's is the sort of typical example, where as an ice cream manufacturer, they said there will be, from day one, a certain percentage of profits that goes to a particular set of social causes. And they embedded that in the creation of and the early running of their organization. And that's one very powerful way to be proactive in your approach around corporate social responsibility. All right, we consider some of the last points here. Workforce diversity. This simply refers to employees in organizations who are different from the run-of-the-mill, whether ethnically, whether from a gender or sex perspective, language, religion, any other characteristics. The general modern orientation towards a diverse workforce is that diversity is potentially a contributor to competitive advantage. And it makes some sense in a world that is now global in nature to have organizations that are more global in their employee makeup. Of course, management would be a very important part of that makeup. And homogeneous organizations, this is the opposite, by the way. Homogeneous is different than heterogeneous. Homogeneous organizations are typically drawn from a locale, and if you wander around the inside of the organization, you can discern demographic elements or characteristics inside the organization. And when you go outside the organization, you see that the outside has come in. And the outside and the inside are very, very similar. Whereas when you seek to remove that homogeneous element and enter into deliberate, hopefully very useful efforts to diversify, you put, for instance, women in managerial roles that typically would only have been held by men in the past. Elements of race or ethnicity, bringing people in for their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and somewhat ignoring elements of race and ethnicity, although it makes some sense. For instance, if you are going to attempt to open up business activities in a new or emerging demographic, say, target market, it makes some sense to bring people in who are from that particular demographic, whether it's race, ethnicity, or any other sort of orientation or set of characteristics, in part because of their understanding. Age of Walmart, Joe Hatfield was running Walmart China for a period of time, and when he was no longer in that role, Walmart wisely brought in a Chinese national to run Walmart China. And that, for Walmart, introduced an element of diversity in their management structure, but was a smart move in terms of kind of handing off the attempts to maintain and expand Walmart's retail efforts in China by bringing someone in with a knowledge of the broad knowledge of the culture, and then by extension you would expect demographic knowledge around preferences in purchasing and those sorts of things. It's a global issue, but it's a global work environment. Canada in particular prides itself on thinking about itself as a multicultural place, welcoming to all, celebrating differences rather than suppressing them, and seeking, just as a nation, to bring additional benefits to Canada through diversity. Organizations, in many ways, are encouraged to have a very similar attitude, whether they're Canadian or not. And managers can help set that tone and make possible that that opportunity so that diversity can thrive. And it means changing the organization and accommodating things that perhaps typically the organization either wasn't positioned to or didn't feel it had to accommodate. And in a modern sense, in a global environment, making those accommodations can offer some pretty beneficial outcomes for organizations. The quote here, I'm sorry I don't have a date, global corporations busy recruiting diverse work groups, and they're using their profit motives, but that in some ways is less cynical than it might appear. Workforce diversity is good for business, and large organizations may have already been able to do it and made themselves open to it. The quote here is that all organizations could stand to benefit from similar types of a change in thinking and accommodating diversity within their employee ranks. Rationalizing why study management, I'm going to leave that for you to consume quickly. Suffice it to say, management is everywhere. You will either manage or be managed throughout much of your work career. And managerialism, a concept we won't consider long at all here this semester, is really the penetration of managerial thinking and valuation and terms into broad society, and that is powerfully at play here. So studying management, not only is it a requirement in the program, but perhaps in terms of personal knowledge and benefit, understanding management and sort of how it thinks and operates can be useful even just from a general you live in the world orientation. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say today. That'll conclude our Chapter 1 lecture series. And thanks for watching. Be sure to read Chapter 1 if you haven't already. And pre-read Chapter 2. That's where we will set our sights on for the coming week. Reading week is coming shortly, and we will delay your midterm exam until after reading week. So those of you wondering about that, please don't fret. We will focus on getting the midterm announced and conducted after reading week. So thanks again for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. While this will lose context the next time that this is viewed, it's about 35 below Celsius here in Medicine Hat at the moment. So I just encourage you to stay warm and stay safe. Thanks.